Hi, I am Joy Axelson, and we are going to look through the book of Ecclesiastes. First, I want to start out with looking at what is wisdom literature. And in today's society, we have many famous people who have many quotes about what wisdom is. For example, Albert Einstein said, "Wisdom is not a product of schooling, but of the lifelong attempt to acquire it." Also, Thomas Jefferson said about wisdom that honesty is the first chapter of the book of wisdom. So there's much that we have about information about what wisdom is in our day. Everybody at some point in their life is looking for wisdom, and this was also true during the time of the Old Testament. Thus, we have wisdom literature included in the Bible. So we want to look at wisdom literature, especially related to Ecclesiastes, also the pessimistic nature of Ecclesiastes, and why some people have had problems with Ecclesiastes being in the Jewish Bible. But first off, let's look at wisdom literature. Wisdom literature was common during the Near East. Examples of wisdom literature and even types like the book of Ecclesiastes have been found in the Babylonian, Egyptian, and Assyrian time periods. Wisdom literature was developed primarily during the time of the monarchy in the history of Israel, and the climax was during the reign of Solomon, who of course we know as the wisest man on earth. The purpose of wisdom literature was to examine the complexity of human life and to give instructions for successful living. Wisdom was a way to try to understand the human existence, even with all the problems of injustice and confusion. They thought that the wisdom literature teachers thought that they could find some sense and thus find out how to control one's life by finding a hidden pattern or order. Wisdom literature uses a lot of parallelisms, if you remember from your Psalms introduction assignments for Module 1. It also includes Proverbs. For example, an example from Ecclesiastes 1:15 is, "What is crooked cannot be made straight, or what is lacking cannot be counted." There are also parables included in wisdom literature. One example in Ecclesiastes is Ecclesiastes 4:13 through 16, where you have the story of a poor youth who becomes king because of his wisdom, but then later on as he becomes older, he becomes forgotten. Also, poems and poes is part of wisdom literature. In Ecclesiastes, there's a lot of rhetorical questions and contrast. There are two types of wisdom literature in the Bible. The first is the positive proverbial wisdom, Proverbs, the book of Proverbs. They're made of short sayings or proverbs that give rules for happy and successful living. The second type is called speculative or pessimistic wisdom, and Job and Ecclesiastes are examples of these. They're made up of proverbs, monologues, which the book of Ecclesiastes is, and dialogue, which Job is. They are longer books, longer sessions of examining life. What is the meaning of life? They try to explain the uncertainties and injustice that happen in human existence, and also in relationship to man's relationship with God. This wisdom is practical and not theoretical, but it tries to challenge the status quo. It is based on human experience, on human observation, not special revelation. This is important to remember. It's based on human reasoning and human wisdom. And it focuses on the individual. In the book of Ecclesiastes, there's no mention of the nation of Israel or the covenant or anything to do with Israel as a nation in and of itself, but it's more focused on the individual. Here are some important interpretation tools for you to think about as you're looking in the wisdom literature in Ecclesiastes. First of all, remember that it's based on human experience or viewpoint. Very often the author of Ecclesiastes will say, I applied my heart to see and seek out, I have seen or saw, I considered, I have tested, a grievous evil have I seen under the sun. So it's repeated on what he has observed, what he has seen, what he has set his heart out to observe in human nature. Ecclesiastes is concerned about what is the meaning of life. So it's based on the author's own observations and opinions. The author of Ecclesiastes is looking at the hard reality of life, what is happening, in contrast with many of the misconceptions or beliefs of the status quo in his day. So again, remember that everything the author says is not necessarily correct. The author also looks at different issues from different viewpoints. So he will examine one area like toil or wisdom or suffering. He'll look at from one perspective or one viewpoint, and then he will again look at from another viewpoint. So there can seem to be kind of contradictory conflicts or contrasts that happen in this book, and that is true, there is. But it's important to notice this and remember as you're going through the book. It's also important that in wisdom literature, when you're interpreting it, remember that the central truth of the whole expresses the meaning of the little parts. What I really mean is that you have to keep in mind the big picture of the book. There's one central truth that the author is trying to bring across, but he will examine it in so many different ways, both good and bad. So it's so important that you keep the big picture in mind as you're going through this book. Also, do not take verses out of context. Context is so key in wisdom literature, because people sometimes will take out a couple of verses and it can totally be the opposite of what the author is trying, or what his main point that he's trying to make, because he will bring up different viewpoints. So somebody just pick out the point he was really not trying to make. So context and big picture are key in interpreting this book. Also keep in mind the reason why it was written. The book that hopefully you all have read at some point by Gordon Fee, How to Read a Bible for All It's Worth, he lists several common mistakes or misinterpretations for wisdom literature. First, people do not read the whole wisdom book and look for its central truth, but put parts of the book out of its context and apply it literally to the modern life. So with wisdom literature, you need to remember to look at the central truth. Secondly, people do not understand the uniqueness of the literary genre. This is a highly compact and figurative ancient Near Eastern literature. Wisdom literature is. So it's important to remember this. Proverbs are also statements of general truths. They are broad sweeps of the pen, not specifically true in every case, every time, statements of truth. Now I want to look at the pessimistic nature in Ecclesiastes. Remember again that wisdom literature begins with the human as the fundamental point of observation, and believes that all of life's answers can be found in experience, and that God placed it there to be found in reality. Wisdom literature teachers often thought that they could find some type of pattern or formula of how God worked. And if you could follow this certain pattern, then you could be righteous, then you could be blessed. And it provided a false sense of security, but life doesn't always turn out like that. So in wisdom literature, to see the good side or the positive side of life, there are words like wisdom, light, eyes, righteous. But on the bad side or disobedient side are words like fool or folly, wickedness, darkness, and death. So the idea was that if you followed this wisdom, if you lived this way, then you would be righteous, and then ultimately you would be blessed, and the blessing would include things like long life, wealth, happiness, all these types of things. But if you didn't follow the wisdom, then you were foolish and you were evil and you would be punished. So the idea of retribution. Because a lot of wisdom literature teachers eventually saw that things in life weren't always so easily spelled out, there became this pessimistic way of writing. So the author of Ecclesiastes is examining this conventional wisdom and said that things don't always happen as the wisdom literature teachers said it would. For example, the author says in Ecclesiastes 9:2, the same event happens to all, to the righteous and the unrighteous, or the wicked. Also in Ecclesiastes 6:8 he says, what advantage has the wise man over the fool? And this is a rhetorical question, and basically he's saying no. So in some ways the author just says, well, wisdom is better than foolishness, but yet in the end it doesn't really make any difference because there's no advantage, because all die. Another quote from Ecclesiastes 7:15, he says, see, the righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and the wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. So basically, if the wicked man, in reality, if he followed the wisdom teachers, he should have died early, and the righteous man had a long life, but in reality, this doesn't always happen. So in this book, the author is very cynical and pessimistic. Ecclesiastes is part of the Hebrew canon, and it was in the third division called the Writings. It was also read during the festival of booths or tabernacles. But because of this, and initially it was accepted as part of the canon, however, because of the skeptical, negative nature of the book, it was later rejected by the conservative rabbinic school of Shaman, because they're like, how can it be so negative about the righteous man, and even some areas of the law? It was just so negative and skeptical. But the liberal rabbinical school of Hillel accepted the book still. And this discussion continued until the time of Jaman, after the fall of Jerusalem. So Jaman existed from 70 AD through 90 AD. But finally, Ecclesiastes was accepted without any question in the Jewish canon, because it was attributed to Solomon, and it has a traditional conclusion that man should fear God and obey his commandments. And it also relates to human reality, human experience, and the confusion that is in life. Ecclesiastes is also a part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Ecclesiastes is a pessimistic type of wisdom literature that has caused a lot of confusion and misunderstanding for many people. But it's important to remember that the author always says that his conclusions are based on his human observation and his own reasoning. But yet, because we believe that Scripture is inspired by God, there is a message that God intends that we should hear and that we need to think about.